Okay, it looks like I'm live now. Had a few issues. My wife also has to do the same thing I'm doing with her job. So you might hear a little voice in the background, but that's the way life is. And it looks as though I am now live. And you get to watch one thing really quickly as I do this. You get to watch me type something in real quick. I We are kind of stuck with this Teams program, and it is not the easiest to send a message to everybody. There's like 4 different steps, and so I'm trying to get all of that in right now, and hopefully we will get everybody here. I'm going to give everyone a couple seconds. So if you want to watch my face go back and forth looking at 3 different computer screens, which as we all know is fun. Okay, so it looks like I'm live. We do have the chat open on YouTube. And if there's any issues on the chat, please let me know. Just chat it on YouTube. And I do not have any way to check. In fact, let me do something real quick. I will open up a window. So I will have the window open on the chat room on Teams, just in case you want to send something there. So you get to watch this process too. It is fun. Okay, so I see there are a few people on, and I'm going to give another second for everybody. Just a couple announcements that I am putting grades in. The Microsoft team technically is supposed to put grades in for me, and it does it automatically into PowerSchool, but for some reason it's done wrong grades on a few people. Someone got a 97 and went down to a 70. I've had people with a 94 go down to a 76, and I don't know why, so I'll have to go in manually by hand into PowerStation and change it. And so if that happens, I'll get to it. And I'm not really sure why that's going on, but that's just the way it is. And the thing about that is, there's going to be quirks. I'll get it straightened out as soon as we can. And some of the grades I'm just going to enter by hand. Like for example, the video on a Java Forward, I'm just going to have to go by hand and do it, which won't be that big of a deal, but it's just too much of a hassle to do it on Microsoft Teams. Okay, one more bit of announcement, just something on the DBQs. I said this the last time too, but I was finishing up grading the DBQs, and people overall did pretty well. But the thing I was looking for are the disagreements about the Treaty of Versailles, and that's why I gave 3 groups. The reservationists, which were liberal but hated Article 10, so a little more conservative than, let's say, the loyal Democrats behind Wilson, who were more liberal because they wanted diplomacy, and conservatives who were mostly irreconcilables, the third group, irreconcilables, who were against it all the way. And that's what I was thinking people would divide their essay into. There were a couple documents for each one, and I thought the last paragraph of your body would be about loyal Democrats and how Wilson refused to compromise when the vote didn't happen. So that's the way I was looking at it, and only a few people did it that way. It didn't mean that You're wrong by doing it the other way, but if you didn't mention the vote and didn't mention Wilson's unwillingness to have reservations and his stroke, etc., you're already in a hole. On the test, a lot of people did not do short answer questions correctly, and we've done now a number of them. In fact, a lot of people did very good jobs on the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and then turned around on this test and wrote me 3 sentences total. A short answer question, if you're doing total war, has to be 3 short IDs. So, for example, the first one would be about how total war was initiated because they couldn't win on the battlefront. The second one would be the changes that came from total war. So something like the bombing of civilians from the air, for that, and then give an example. And then the third short ID would be on, let's say, starvation blockade and unrestricted submarine warfare. The 3 short IDs. Now, if you did that on one of them, maybe I'll give you a chance to do one and turn it in, and maybe I'll give you a few extra points. But that was a big problem, and I wrote the directions a number of different places on there. And so, oh, you can see a message. No, you can't see it. My face is blocking. I get messages pop up on notification. It's a little bit confusing. And then one more thing. When you turn something in, please turn it in on Teams just simply because it's easier to keep track of, but I will get it by email. If you have to or it's not working, just simply add a file. But we're going to make this work. Tomorrow I'm going to try to go at the same time. It's just an issue with technical issues and how much bandwidth we have on our Wi-Fi. But I'm going to try to go at the same time on the second New Deal. So let's go ahead and get started, because yesterday we did the causes of the New Deal. And so let's go to or the causes of the Great Depression. I'm sorry, let's get to the New Deal and the 1930s. And I see a few people on, and if you have any questions, please go to the chat room. I will be able to see Teams, and I will be able to see YouTube. I might be a little behind. There's probably it's about a 10 or 15 second delay. Let me make sure the sound's okay. Sorry, there's another voice in the background that I can hear, so it's a little bit distracting, but I'll work through it. And so let's get to the New Deal in the 1930s. And just to review, remember, the policy then was trickle-down economics, conservative economics. And that was basically the goal of President Hoover. And so when we get to 1932, the worst year of the Great Depression, one of the biggest events that happened, and one that, that's the reason I wanted you to watch The Road to Rock Bottom, was the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army was one of the most dramatic events of that entire era. My face is blocking part of the picture, so I'll move myself over, and then I'll probably move myself back. But 14,000 people marched on Washington, D.C. And these were veterans. A sergeant named Walter Williams. He came up with the idea of, let's collect a bonus that was due in 1945. Let's collect it now. This would put purchasing power in the hands of workers right away, and this should remind you of something already, the 1894 Coxey's Army. The same idea, the March on Washington, D.C. for jobs. Well, these are veterans who were promised a tiny bonus. And remember, conservatives opposed this bonus in the first place. So, of course, they're going to oppose paying for it right now. They thought if we march on Washington, D.C., people will have this patriotic fervor, and they will remember the sacrifice that soldiers made and want to help them. This will put purchasing power in demand. Remember, one of the big causes of the Great Depression was debt deflation. People were not spending money. Demand was low. And so this would put money into their hands. So they marched to Washington, D.C. Many brought their families. They made encampments. Washington, D.C., the area that's Washington, D.C. now is all pretty much urbanized. But there were areas then called Anacostia Flats, which were like these salt, marshy flats along the Potomac River. And they camped there. They camped in parks. They camped in abandoned buildings and marched on Washington, D.C. Hoover ignored them publicly. Privately, he was furious that they would march, even though he did have the army send some supplies and encampments or tents and a few things for him. For the most part, though, he ignored them, which was the equivalent of being against them. He basically said they should go home, and that's it. But They marched for the bonus, and remember, the House and the Senate both have to agree to a bill. And the House voted yes, but the Senate voted no. And the reason they voted was at the urgence of President Hoover. And so that's blocked by the picture. I thought I had that in there, but make sure you put that in there. Let's see. Yeah. Before we get to the Army, remove them. Hoover insisted that the Senate vote against it. And most Republicans and virtually all conservatives were opposed. So that's conservative Democrats and Republicans were opposed to this. This is government aid. They didn't earn it. Now, they had no problem with giving virtually no interest loans to big business. They had almost no problem giving money to corporations or to not really give any aid at all to the poor. And so they had no problem with that. And so they voted no, and then Hoover had the Army remove them. 2 vets killed. Estimates are as high as 100 wounded. They removed them by force. There was smoke and burning right next to the Capitol. This was fighting in the streets. And think about what this looks like. This kind of looks like revolution. An army marching on Washington, D.C. In Europe, both left-wing communists and right-wing, more and more being called fascists, they had their own private armies that would march and rally in fights on the streets, and this looked like that. But it also made Hoover seem, well, he was blamed, and justifiably so. It made it seem uncaring, and it made it look like that the United States cared very little about the actual veterans of the country. The working people, the forgotten Americans, as it was known as. Hoover came out as being cold, arrogant, and unfeeling, which, knowing Herbert Hoover, is actually really close to the truth. And so this was a major effort. In fact, FDR realized, probably correctly, this will probably win me the election. Well, here's a little bit of that bonus army. That's a job at 4. We're not going to watch that here. I stuck it in there in case I thought about it. But let's get to Franklin Roosevelt. Because Franklin Roosevelt was looking like the front runner to the Democratic nomination. Now, the thing about Franklin Roosevelt was this. In 1920, he was on his way up. He was following the trajectory of his very famous cousin, Teddy Roosevelt. He had been Undersecretary of the Navy during World War I and came up with a glowing reputation. He was very intelligent, charming, had all the things a politician wants, and had a fantastic voice for the new media of radio. He was the Democratic nominee for vice president in 1920, even though they got trounced in the conservative boom of the 1920s. Even though he got trounced, he looked like he was going places. But then in 1921, he went to, in the Finger Lakes of New York, there was a Boy Scout Jamboree, did the politician thing, visited people there. Came back at night, what felt like the flu. The flu turned into a horrible illness by the next day, and within a week he was paralyzed, or seemingly paralyzed from the neck down. And it appeared as though he had contracted polio. And I can't even begin to tell you what a big deal polio was. Polio was the most terrifying disease imaginable. The virus was not that transferable, but it lived a long time, and it seemed to affect everybody. So that picture of the information for tourists, the polio outbreak. It could happen anywhere, anytime, and the greatest fear was that polio would hit people, and polio would be contracted, and people would be, that's a little off center, so it's kind of bugging me. There we go. And this polio people would be contracted with polio, or people would contract polio, and the big issue was that nobody knew how bad it would be. It could be you would be sick for a couple weeks, like with the flu, and then the next thing you know, it was you could be relatively healthy. I just got a question on YouTube, and I just noticed The thing about it was is that when Hoover sent out the Army during the Bonus Army, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army was Douglas MacArthur, whose father was a Medal of Honor winner from the Civil War and headed the Filipino insurrection. And MacArthur, it said in the video that MacArthur disobeyed orders to remove the Bonus Army from their camps at Anacostia Flats. And yes, that's what the video said, and that's technically true. But his orders were to remove them from Washington, D.C. And therefore, he interpreted that as removing them from Anacostia Flats too, and not just the city proper. And so, yes, technically, he disobeyed orders. And this is a little bit apologetic to Hoover. But Hoover's orders were to get rid of him. And once it started happening, Hoover ignored it. And as recent scholarship has shown, even after that video, Hoover was actually privately pleased, but he also knew it's going to look really bad for him. So I'm glad we asked that question. Thank you. And so back to this. So polio. And so the thing about polio was you could contract it for 2 weeks, be sick, and then be fine again. But the bad part was you could contract polio, and in a week you could be paralyzed for life. That figure just above my face, that is, that's weird, but those are iron lungs. And that's a really scary picture. All those people in iron lungs right there. And that became the symbol of polio. That paralyzed from the neck down, they could not breathe without this hollow tube creating a vacuum that would press down on the lungs to try to encourage you to suck in air, release it to release air. And people would spend the rest of their life. That became the symbol, the terror of parents. The idea that their kid would go to school one day, one student there had polio, they would contract it, and boom, their kids might be paralyzed for life. Or they could be partially paralyzed from the waist down, shoulders down, etc. And this great fear, everybody knew there was no cure, everybody talked about it, and then all of a sudden this up-and-coming politician got it, Franklin Roosevelt. And that the assumption was his career was over. By the way, the Guillain-Barré syndrome, there's recent study now that it maybe wasn't polio, an autoimmune disease that affected and acted very much like polio. At least the symptoms were like polio and could lead to paralysis. This syndrome could have been what FDR had. And the thing is, maybe a lot of people who had polio did have some kind of immune deficiency disorder. But they looked the same, and back then they had no way to know. But he had limited feeling in some areas. And so maybe that also encouraged him to work so hard. But the assumption was his career was over. He's gone, this up-and-coming politician. And then it came out about 2 weeks after he got polio, contracted polio, which everyone thought he did, that he was not paralyzed from the neck down, but what happened was that he was paralyzed from the waist down. Never walk again. And the fact that things said now he's a half a man, horrible discrimination against this disability. But his career's over, he's done. And oh, it's so sad, this up-and-coming politician. And then something remarkable happened. In 1928, Al Smith was nominated for the Democratic Convention. The person who gave the nominating speech was Franklin Roosevelt, who was paralyzed from the waist down, and everybody knew it. Polio was such a horrible disease. He was paralyzed, and then he did something incredible. At the convention, he walked to the podium and then stood at the podium and gave the nominating speech for Al Smith. People couldn't believe it. He walked to the podium. And how did he do that? Well, he claimed through hard work, determination, he had beat polio. I can't even begin to tell you what a big deal it was. But what he did was one of the most remarkable bits of play acting and image ever. Now I'm going to play a little bit of video. Hopefully the sound works on this. But this is from FDR, the American Experience on him. And it shows what he did using heavy leg braces and wrapped around his hip. These heavy braces could lock when his legs were straight. And by using his stomach muscles, he could kind of shift his legs with these braces and then stand. This was incredibly hard. Needed powerful shoulders, and how hard this must have been on his stomach and how tiring. He could do it with crutches at first, but then he learned how to give the illusion of walking. He had aid. He had somebody there walking, but let's watch just a little bit of this video. Oops, it did not work. I hit the wrong button. Let's go back. And let's see if this works. Oh, I moved.
But crutches weren't good enough. He knew they were political poison. They would, he said, inspire pity. He learned instead to appear in public with a cane.
And he developed this technique that looked like walking. His sons were strong men. They took exercises so their arms would be as strong as a parallel bar. And he would lean on
think about it, as strong as a parallel bar.
Putting all his weight on it. And then he would switch his weight from the son's arm onto a cane, which he carried in the other hand, so that he could switch his weight from side to side and thus progress. And he instructed his sons, you must not let people see that this is difficult or takes effort or it hurts. They would chat and joke and laugh as they went along. It was a slow process. But they looked as though they were taking their time so they could smile at people and say hello to the crowd as they went along. And it was showbiz, but it worked.
Look at his knees. It almost looks like he's moving his knees.
Only 4 seconds of film exist which clearly show the walk Franklin so tirelessly practiced.
Smiling, looking casual.
To take enough steps to get from a car into a building or from his seat on the stage to the podium and back again. If he could do that without seeming hopelessly crippled, he'd succeeded.
Roosevelt.
So the big thing is, it was illusion, image. Remember what I told you about image. He gave the illusion that he could walk through incredible hard work, but it made it look like he beat polio. And for the most part, photographers never took pictures of him like that picture right there with his granddaughter. Here he is on a wheelchair. They never took a picture of that. There's a picture of his wheelchair and the very heavy, tiring, uncomfortable, painful leg braces he learned to wear and take it. The picture in the middle, that's him walking at a baseball game. There's a couple little bits of film of that, but not as good as where you can see his legs pop up. And there he is giving his speech, and that's actually in Montana. That's at Fort Peck Dam. And he's giving that speech for the building of the dam where he could give the illusion that he beat polio. Oh, not 100%. But the important thing about the image is this. He beat polio. And if he could beat the most feared disease that everyone had, what the heck is the Great Depression? He could beat that. He could beat anything. What an amazing illusion. And so with that, he would be the governor of New York in 1930 and then run for the presidency. He came up with a term for his program called the New Deal. Not to be clear about it, it was slightly accidental. It was at the Democratic Convention, and this New Deal would mean aggressive government action. He meant to use the powers of government to regulate, to pump money into the economy. He meant government action. Now, he was a little bit vague about what it would mean on the campaign trail, but everybody knew what it meant. That it's going to be the government is going to energetically act act to get out of the Depression. This was the remnants of populist or progressive reform. But the name came from actually kind of an accident. He was the first nominee to speak at the convention. He was listening in Albany, New York. Remember, he's governor of New York. And the convention was in Chicago. When he heard that he got the nomination, he flew and gave a nominating address, which they all give now. And he jumped in a Ford tri-motor, had 3 motors, Ford used to make planes then, and flew to Chicago. And the big thing about taking the plane was, it was more than just, he took a plane. Today people take planes. But back then, it was seen as different, new, exciting. Presidents always rode trains. And he took this new technology, A crisis like this needs something new and exciting, and he took a plane. And that's why that cartoon has it with a plane. And one more important thing, he would not be the only politician to do that. There'd be other politicians. In fact, a certain politician who in Nazi Germany named Adolf Hitler used to have propaganda posters of Hitler over Germany, and to be a picture of him in a plane. And so the idea of something new and exciting. But in his speech, when he said, we are going to act with aggressive action, his convention, or at the nominating convention, he gave a speech where he said, I pledge to you, I pledge to myself, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. For a new deal. And this cartoon came out of the New Deal being dropped to the forgotten Americans. Now you read that, forgotten Americans. The idea was that Hoover, ignoring the bonus army, Americans were suffering and nobody cared, and Roosevelt promises aggressive action. But the New Deal became a stroke of brilliance. Not only did it become then a name for its program, but it harkened back to his cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, and the Square Deal. And so with that, the election of 1932 was an absolute destruction of Hoover. It was a Democratic sweep, and Roosevelt won almost every state in the Union. But I should add, a lot of this wasn't necessarily pro-New Deal. Yes, they were happy Roosevelt was promising some kind of energetic action. But it was also just an anti-Hoover vote. Roosevelt's going to have to do something. We saw the similar thing in 2008. Then Senator Obama defeated John McCain. Part of the reason he defeated John McCain was that the Republican John McCain was tied to the terrible crash that was going on right then under George W. Bush. And George W. Bush was one of the most unpopular presidents in history when he left office. And so a lot of President Obama's vote and the Democratic vote in 2008 was anti-Republican. And that could switch really fast, as it kind of did in 2010. Because, well, that's another story. But the election of 1932, ironically, that winter, remember, the president is elected in November. He didn't take office till March. In fact, part of the reason it would change to January was because of this winter. A similar thing would happen to Abraham Lincoln. The winter of 32-33 was the worst year of the Depression. Absolute chaos. Economic, more unemployed. The winter was bad. There were food shortages. There was food riots. But it was partially was we had the remnants of the River Rouge violence from a year earlier that winter. And so there were food riots in Detroit, food riots in Akron, food riots in New York. Not only that, there were revolt on the farms. And that picture is a shanty town on a farm. Farms who were being foreclosed on, sharecroppers being kicked off from the farm. Some of them rebelled. Some of them actually marched on towns. Farmers actually took over Sioux City, Iowa. And we're going to say, we're not going to lose our farms anymore. We're not going to be foreclosed. And then a series of bank failures began. And the bank failures became the worst of the entire Depression. And Hoover, sitting back in Washington, D.C., furious that he lost, he really believed he was going to win easily, wanted to punish the American people. His dream was that Roosevelt would come in, use aggressive economic action, fail, and Hoover would come back in 32. In fact, Hoover did everything he could to make the Depression worse. He purposely tried to keep governments, the federal government from helping bank action. In fact, he tried to coerce Roosevelt into accepting policies that would make it worse while Roosevelt was still president-elect. Hoover, in fact, in Michigan, Hoover tried to encourage bank failures. And that picture in the bottom next to me, that is a Hooverville next to New York City in Central Park. But Hoover actually tried to make it worse and then turned around and said, FDR tried to scuttle Hoover's needed efforts to make the system work. And so he wanted to hamstring FDR into promising policies that FDR knew would fail. Hoover, I'm not going to lie to you, was kind of a scoundrel here. He was so desperate to prove that conservative economics was the way out of this that he wanted to make the policy worse. And so with that, when FDR was inaugurated, the country was literally at the most scary, the worst time in its history. And so we're going to watch a little bit of New York FDR now, just a couple seconds, and then I'm going to stop it. But I'm going to play you just a little bit. And I'm going to zap out of the screen really quick because I have to go get something. But we're going to play just a bit. Imagine the worst time of the Depression. People were glued to the radios to watch FDR. Oop, we bounced ahead. It did it again. Here we go.
But in March of 1933, the homeless and the poor lost an advocate in Congress.
It's about Mayor LaGuardia of New York.
In a Democratic landslide, LaGuardia returned to a New York where victims of the Depression camped in cardboard shanties. LaGuardia swore he would give up politics, but few believed he would stay on the sidelines if Roosevelt's New Deal could help the city of New York.
History turns a page. President and Mrs. Hoover, leaving the White House after 4 trying years, greet Mrs. Roosevelt on the portico. The President-elect awaits them in the car in which he and Mr. Hoover will ride to the Capitol together. The retiring President and the new. The man...
So the funny thing about this is Hoover didn't want to go to the inauguration. He was so furious that Roosevelt was not going to follow his conservative trickle-down economics, and also furious that Roosevelt's going to destroy the country. He thought, I'm going home. I'll show everybody. Only 2 presidents in history have not shown up to their successor's inauguration. And that's both Adams, John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And Hoover was finally convinced to do this. And Hoover was just furious. And he thought Roosevelt would destroy the country. So when he got into this limousine, FDR was there waiting for him. Remember, FDR had to be kind of carried and put into a car because of his paralysis. FDR is sitting there. Hoover got in. Now, FDR had this gift. He's one of those politicians. He remembered everyone's name. A great gift for a politician. I don't have that. A lot of people don't. Things get jumbled. He didn't have that problem. Another thing about FDR was he was incredibly charming. He could talk to somebody and just, sweep them off their feet. There's a story about when he's president, how, and this story from many different people, that people would walk in, never meeting FDR before, and come up with a proposal. And they would spend 5 minutes with FDR and talk to FDR and walk out of that office thinking 2 things. Number 1, that FDR agrees with them totally, FDR is 100% behind them, and number 2, they have a new best friend in the world, and that person is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Another person can come in right after and say the exact same, or go through the, or say exactly the opposite thing, come with a totally different proposal, and that person would walk out thinking 2 things. Remember, they thought the exact opposite of that first person. The first thing, that Roosevelt agrees with them totally, and Roosevelt's behind him 100%. And number 2, they have a new best friend in the world, and that's Franklin Roosevelt. Now, sometimes this could get Roosevelt in trouble because it would make him seem duplicitous and dishonest, but he just had this gift. So when Hoover sat down next to him, Roosevelt thought, I'm going to charm him, I'm going to talk to him, like I do with everybody. And so Roosevelt looked at Hoover when he came in and started talking to him, giving a little pleasantries. Hoover just stared forward. Roosevelt said a few words. Now, this is from Roosevelt's son who's sitting in the front seat. Roosevelt said a few more words, and finally Hoover just simply glared, turned to Roosevelt, and went, rah! Then looked back forward again. That's all he said. He was, rah! And never talked again. Roosevelt shrugged his shoulders and waved to the crowd, thinking, I won, we'll go from there. And so they got there. Remember, people all over the country are listening. So I'm going to step out of screen while you watch this first part. Now listen to Roosevelt's voice. Think how good this sounds on the radio. The secure, and yes, it's patrician, but at the same time, it's this patrician who cares about regular people. Oh, I'm back in. Why does it do that? I don't know.
But in March of 1933, the homeless and the poor lost an advocate in Congress.
The president-elect awaits them in the car in which he and Mr. Hoover will ride to the Capitol together. The retiring president and the new, the man who bore the burdens and the man who now assumes them. An historical moment in the life of a nation is approaching.
I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Broad executive power.
This is driving me nuts. Sorry about that, people.
But in March of 1930,
One more time.
And the man who now assumes them. An historical moment in the life of a nation is approaching.
I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
And the big thing about that is there he is asking directly for action like it's a war. And what he meant by that is, I'm taking this seriously. This is not, we'll let the market decide, some people win or lose, and we'll let things correct. No, this is a wartime situation, and I'm going to act like it's at war. And part of this speech is, everybody remembers a couple words for it. Let me read you a couple things that he said. Now remember, people are paralyzed by fear, terrified about tomorrow, worried that the economy is going to be bad, but don't forget also there's a banking crisis at that moment. Banks are shutting down all over. So let me read to you the first part of the speech. Now I know I could play you little video clips, but I don't want you to listen to the whole thing. So I'll read it in my best FDR voice, which I can't do. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Now, you hear that. People have heard the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. And well, okay, that's a weird thing to say. No, remember what he's saying. He's not saying that, or the context of what he's saying in it. He's not saying just don't be afraid. He's saying, yes, times are bad, but it doesn't mean panic. It doesn't mean that we can't advance and move on to a better, to trust our banks, trust our institutions. I promise to be fair. And then he adds this: the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temples of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths, that the measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit. So he is laying the blame for this depression on the bankers, the financiers, the speculators, and the money changers. This was a fairly religious time, and he's referring to at least the New Testament of the Bible. And he's saying that it was their effort to get greedy what caused this, not you. Those unemployed or those who are working or trying to work, but they have been laid off or now working for almost no pay. It's not your fault. We know you want to work. Happiness lies not in the mere possession of money. It lies in the achievement, in the thrill of creative effort. The joy and moral stimulation of work no longer must be forgotten in the mad chase for profits. These dark days will be worth all they cost if they teach us that our true destiny is to not be ministered unto, but ministered to ourselves and our fellow men. And so what he's saying there is, I'm going to return to a situation where work matters and work will be rewarded, not speculation and a few people who have figured out financial instruments to get rich. And that last section there, I'm not going to lecture to you about work hard. We're going to listen to what the people want and make this situation better. And so people listened to this speech and it created a stir. But I am going to reduce the size of this because I've learned something in the trial and error of this. Sorry about that. We are moving a few things around. It's hard to adjust the screen when you do that. So now let's go back here and present again. And let's watch just a little bit more of this. Okay.
Invaded by a foreign foe.
The energy that was let loose right after that inauguration was enormous. Washington had never known anything like it. Stylistically, there was just this abundance of movement.
Imagine being Roosevelt's grandson.
And a sense of let's get on with the problem. And you felt that this guy came and he's going to save the people. And a tremendous feeling for him. Holy hell, the people that could kiss his toenails. That's how much they loved this guy.
I think he was primarily a person who was convinced that there was poverty in the country, need in the country, and he wanted to do something to help.
So that's where we get to Roosevelt in his inauguration. I love the guy, kiss his toes. He loves Roosevelt so much he didn't know how to put it. But the thing is, here's Roosevelt, and unlike Hoover, he seemed to understand that there are real problems. And he wanted to do something about them. And so here's a great art cover from New Yorker, and I think that's pretty appropriate. The glum Hoover, who still, for the rest of his life, assumed he would be brought back. In fact, he would spend much of his life trying to rehabilitate his image and saying that Roosevelt actually made things worse. And there is a significant number of people who believe that to this day. I find that almost impossible to imagine, just factually, to look at the way the situation was. But you'll see people say that to this day. The New Deal made it worse. And so let's get to the first New Deal. And the first New Deal is what we would call that first 100 days. When Roosevelt came in knowing that he's got this Democratic Congress and the people are going to want action, and if he moves quickly, he can get a lot of people behind the first New Deal. And there would be 13 major bills, 11 new initiatives. And you'll see that by that little table, as Roosevelt is the doctor of all the New Deal remedies, they all had acronyms. So we get this kind of alphabet soup of all these different and new programs. And the big thing Roosevelt understood is the people wanted action, to do something. And so he was willing to try anything. He was experiment. I'll try new programs, and if they don't work, we'll throw them out. Now, politically, this is actually pretty hard to do, because if a program does fail, then there'll be a lot of people thinking, hey, you don't know what you're doing. And it's harder to experiment today, because there are always going to be glitches. There's no glitches in this program here. But his number one goal was to save capitalism. He wanted progressive reforms to reform this system to save it, because he was terrified that what would come out of it was two very scary things from Europe. The thought was this could lead to communism, and no one knew the monstrous police state, or no one knew how bad the monstrous police state Stalin was creating. No one knew outside of the Soviet Union. Or fascism. A right-wing dictatorship where just a small group of people called an oligarchy would run things, and Nazi Germany was literally just starting. It's no coincidence that you have Nazi Germany, the growth of Nazi Germany out of the Depression. At the same time, you have Franklin Roosevelt. Even though they're totally different, they were both reactions to the Great Depression. And he would dub this system to save capitalism liberal. using progressive or populist kind of reforms and more to save capitalism. Now let's be clear about it. He wanted to save it. Therefore, he's not a socialist. He's not a communist. In fact, the communists and socialists despised him. But all of his opponents would call him a red or a Bolshevik, etc. And he began a series of initiatives, which I'm going to reduce my mug here. There we go. I'm even smaller. So these are all the initiatives. These will go in order with the video. So let's watch a little bit more of the video. Please start where I want it. Yeah.
New York had declared a bank holiday for the banks in New York. But
You can watch me watch.
Roosevelt followed it up with a bank holiday for the national government and throughout the country.
So don't worry about this yet.
By early 1933,
Look at this shot.
Americans were lining up to withdraw their money from a banking system on the brink of collapse.
So if you look at that, that is a man, that's a head of a bank telling his people, telling the people in the bank, we're almost out of money.
Roosevelt closed the banks for 4 days and pushed through an emergency banking bill.
Emergency banking bill.
Authorizing $2 billion in new money to help pay off depositors.
So, the emergency banking bill, and this Emergency Banking Act, and the Emergency Banking Administration, but the Emergency Banking Bill, the big thing about this was, the bill, when it became a law, became an act. This pumped in $2 billion into the banking system, and basically gave banks $2 billion so they had money to pay back their depositors, because they didn't have money to pay back their depositors. And then they closed the banks down and did a bank holiday for 4 days. And this was a really important step. They claimed that federal inspectors would go into the banks and would not allow banks to open unless they were healthy. Now the thing was, there were very few banking inspectors. So the Emergency Banking Act was in reality illusion. It was to try to convince people that the banks were healthy. Remember, so much of this is confidence. Do you believe that the banks will be there tomorrow so you won't run to the banks and get money out? And this would lead to, well, let's get to the conclusion in just a second. Now, he knows he has to sell this, and he went and talked to the American public, and I can't even begin to tell you what a big deal this was.
The new president went on radio with the first of his fireside chats.
Fireside chats.
I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days, why it was done, and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the
He made
legislature...
listeners feel as though he were talking to them and to them individually and alone. And this was a remarkable technique that he had.
Roosevelt would caress with his voice the microphone. And he treated the people as though they had intelligence.
Weird,
Let us
huh?
unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
I remember in those days, if you went through any area during the fireside chats, you could hear them walking down the street. You didn't have to worry about getting home in order to hear it, because it would be turned on all the way home.
We would ourselves sit down and talk over what he had said, and then we would look at what was happening all around about us, but still come out feeling good about it, feeling better than we had felt, though we had problems.
We were...
What happened here? What the heck?
Something to help. New York had declared a...
as though they had somebody who understood them, somebody who spoke to them. Other politicians found him mendacious and tricky.
Which he was, I told you.
But he was also had a direct pipeline to the people.
And so the big thing about that is, and I can't get the thing to stop, so I'm sorry about that.
New York had declared a bank holiday.
But the thing was that now he went out and talked to the people, and this amazing gift. He made people feel like they're part of the process. And talking to the people helped so much. And he had this incredible voice. And he sounded so good on the radio. But heck, even people who don't sound good, when they go talk to the people, it makes them feel involved. Without a doubt, right now, President Trump's daily press conferences has helped him, even though the federal government has made innumerable mistakes about not getting respirators, by not taking it seriously, by acting like it's going to go away, this pandemic. He's out there talking to people. It sounds like they're doing something. And so let me get to this. Oh, why is this doing this? Sorry about that.
Something to help. New York
Best laid plans of mice and men.
To the people.
When the banks reopened, deposits exceeded withdrawals.
It worked.
Roosevelt had restored confidence, not only in the banks, but in the possibility of recovery.
It worked. The banks opened up
In the
again.
first 100 days of the New Deal, Roosevelt and Congress created 10 new agencies to combat the effects of the Depression. The alphabet soup of New Deal programs.
It did it again. I'm very sorry about this.
Something to help. New York had declared a bank holiday for the bank.
What the heck? Why isn't this working?
Something to help.
Programs had immediate impact on the lives of millions.
So let's go through a few of these and I'll go back, because clearly this is not stopping the way I wanted to.
The first jobs program, the Civilian Conservation Corps,
CCC.
put 250,000 young men to work restoring the nation's forests.
So the CCC, I'll come back to them. It wasn't that big of a program.
Roosevelt preferred a system of work relief to giving out welfare checks. But the president decided he had to push for direct federal relief, or millions would starve.
Once again, it was a small program, but this gave direct money.
Absolutely new program for the federal government to be engaged in, that is to be handing out relief. It wasn't much handed out on any level, and suddenly for it to be a major program with millions of dollars involved, with people getting money for nothing, as it was said by
The conservative point of view.
President Roosevelt has given me the job of administering
His most trusted advisor, Harry Hopkins.
The Emergency Relief Act of 1933 to help care for the 18 million persons whom the Depression has plunged from self-support to public dependency.
In his first 2 hours on the job, Harry Hopkins dispensed $5 million in relief funds.
I came to work for the FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, in September of 19...
How come that was working before and not working now? The thing about FERA was, it was direct aid. So these are checks to people. It wasn't very much, but it was a little bit.
For most of us, this was our first job. And we were terribly wrapped up in what we were doing, very excited about it, felt that the future of the world depended upon us.
So there was never any difference between work in the office and being away from the office. When we went to eat or to restaurants or go even taking our wives dancing that hot
You know, as husband and wife, very proud of what they did.
Roof of the Powhatan Hotel, very few people danced. They talked the whole time. We were talking about our jobs.
Eleanor Roosevelt would get literally thousands of letters a day, and poor Harry Hopkins would get the brunt of them, with my grandmother writing on the top in hand, "Harry, can't we do something about this person?"
With the government programs underway, Roosevelt turned his attention to the private sector.
So we're coming to the National Recovery Act, which created the National Recovery Administration, the NRA.
Blue Eagles loyal legions on parade.
If we were in my room,
Millionaire and office boy,
That eagle that's up, NRA eagle, which is by my screen, is this.
250,000 economic warriors forming the greatest peacetime demonstration in American history.
In September 1933, the government sponsored a spectacular parade up New York's Fifth Avenue to promote an unprecedented federal effort, the National Recovery Administration. Roosevelt called the NRA a partnership in planning between government and industry. Its goal, to speed recovery by establishing profit levels for business and wage levels for labor. In a show of national solidarity, more than 2 million employers across the country promised to abide by the NRA code.
So the big thing about these NRA codes, what they did is Roosevelt thought he could create this all-encompassing administration that could control production completely. And so that's what we got to get. They would set conditions on wages, production, and profits. Wages, productions, and profits. They would do all three of these things. Roosevelt thought we could control the entire process. He was thinking about the War Productions Board from World War I and thought how that organized the country for war. Let's do that for the country at Depression. The problem was it didn't work during the war and didn't work very well during the war, and soon it became too cumbersome and favored big business too much. And I have no idea how to make this work. I can get it to stop.
New York had declared a bank holiday for the banks in New York, but Roosevelt followed it up with a bank holiday.
Roosevelt turned his attention to the private sector. The NRA, a partnership in planning between government and industry. Its goal, to speed recovery by establishing profit levels for business and wage levels for labor. In a show of national solidarity, more than 2 million employers across the country promised to abide by the NRA codes.
The NRA means to me a steady job with more pay. The extra thanks is in handy. I got a new job and it's great to be working again.
Get this.
Thanks to President Roosevelt's plan, the NRA, which has made it possible for me to resume my position as a mannequin.
I am 100% in back of President Roosevelt's recovery act, and I want every one of my customers to know it.
I have no idea. And then Section 7A would allow for unions.
Also supported the right of employees to form unions and bargain collectively.
So it allowed them to form unions. You have to get that.
Workers in New York City used the NRA to win higher wages and better working conditions.
It was almost enough for a president of this great nation to take account of us foreigners, which is what all of the union members were, practically without any exception, and acknowledge that things are bad and that workers are permitted to organize.
We must say that the NRA improved our naval industry. We are able now to make a living better than any time before. We work in short hours and getting better pay. Long live President Roosevelt.
I have no idea what he said.
Not everyone applauded Roosevelt's New Deal. Senator Thomas Gore, a Democrat from Oklahoma, was an outspoken opponent.
My grandfather felt that any kind of government regulation was wrong. One of the things that he disliked about Roosevelt was not only the centralizing of all power, but this vast bureaucracy. He kept all those acronyms. He kept setting up NRA and this and that. Unlike Hoover, Roosevelt would try anything.
So, that's finally where I want to stop. And so, one more thing, we're going to quit right there. But the NRA, the National Recovery Act, it allowed for unions to organize. It tried to establish industrial production, and organized industry did not work. It became too big, too cumbersome. It favored big business. And the Supreme Court would find it unconstitutional by 1936. Now, ironically, the NRA by then, Roosevelt had given up on it. It was not working. But there are going to be other parts of the New Deal. I will do that tomorrow. I'll try to get going a little bit earlier, add a few technical issues. the video thing does not work as well as I thought, but hopefully you're able to see and get some information from it. But I'll do this tomorrow, and I'll come back on tomorrow. I'll give a few more announcements. I have a few details about the AP exam, but very few details. And also I got to talk about spring break, because originally I was going to have an assignment over spring break, but it looks like now I'm not going to have any additional assignment except for a review packet, which I now have to redo because it looks like the AP exam is changing. And you are going to be accountable for this information. I'm not sure how I'm going to do this. On Friday, we might just have a couple short answer questions, but we're going to have something on this. But that is where I'm going to quit. I'll finish the rest of the first New Deal and everything else tomorrow. So on that happy note, I'm going to stop streaming. If you have any questions, please ask, and I guess that will be